Hi, how you doing? I'm Dan Lynch, a.k.a. Storyman Dan. I don't know if you saw our first program, but we represent the Springfield Storytellers. We're a group of people who love the tradition of storytelling. We love to hear stories, we love to tell stories, we love to write stories. And we get together once a month, the third Friday of every month, up at 1000 Wilbraham Road, right across from Duggan Academy. And we tell stories. So if you're interested, please come the third Friday of some month at 7 o'clock. If you have questions, you can call me at 543-5542, and I'd be happy to answer them for you. Jeremy is Jeremy Lord, who's one of our fine storytellers, and I think he's going to treat us tonight with a story from Cutler Harbor, Maine. So without further ado, Jeremy Lord.
Thank you, Dan. Well, yeah, Dan, I grew up in down East Maine. My dad was a storyteller, my grandfather was a storyteller, so I'm just picking up on the tradition. I want to tell you a story I've heard 100 times down east. I grew up down at Cutler Harbor. It's called No News. You see, and it's a story about Doris Cooper. Now, Doris Cooper grew up down at Cutler Harbor like I did, and Doris had really never left Maine before until that one time her sister down in Framingham, Massachusetts, took to bed. Got awful sick, and Doris went down all the way to Framingham to look after her. And when she came back, she took the train back and arrived in Bangor. And Sadie Jones went over to meet her at the train, drive her back to Cutler Harbor. When they were driving back in the car, Doris said to Sadie, tell me, I've been away for almost 2 months from Cutler Harbor, and tell me what news from town. Oh, Sadie said, well, there ain't no news. It's been an awful quiet summer. Nothing's really happened. Well, she said, I've been away 2 months. For sure, something must have happened. I mean, just come on, I'm just hungry for news of Cutler Harbor. Well, she says, I can't think of a thing. Well, that's the strangest thing. Well, she said, there is one thing. Well, what's that? Well, your dog died. What? She said, my dog died? Brownie's died? Yes, I'm sorry to tell you that, but yeah, Brownie died. Oh, she said, that's terrible. I love that dog so much. She said, well, how did he die? Well, he ate burnt horseflesh. He ate burnt horseflesh and he died? Well, how did that happen? Well, it was right after your barn burned down. See, your barn burned down and your horse was in the barn, and they couldn't save it. And that horse was in the ashes, and Brownie got into the ashes, and he got eaten that burned up horse of yours, and he got sick and he died. Oh, my Lord, that's just terrible. What caused the fire that burned the barn down? She says, well, it was a spark. A spark from where? Well, she said, it was from your house. You don't mean a spark from the house? Well, yes, you see the house was on fire, and the sparks were going up, and I guess one of those sparks went right over and landed on the barn, burned the whole thing up. And how about the house? Oh, no, the house is gone too. The house is gone. Well, how did the fire in the house start? Well, you see, there was a wake in the house. Your mother-in-law died, and they were waking her in the house, and they put 4 candles, a candle on each side of the coffin. And George Forrest hit one of the candles, and it knocked it over, and that fire got in the curtains, and before we knew it, the whole house was just inflamed, and then that spark got over into the barn, burned it up, and that's what happened. Well, she said, well, who died? Well, it was your mother-in-law died. Well, how did she die? Well, it was a stroke, a shock. It was a shock, turned into a stroke. Well, what happened? Well, the ladies from the Baptist church went over to tell her that your husband had run off with a minister's wife, and when she heard that, she had a stroke and died. Okay.
But other than that, there
Other
was
than
no
that,
news.
no news.
Stories are wonderful. I hope you people that are watching this are enjoying this as much as we are. And I hope we'll see you, of course. But anyway, we'd like another story now from a retired cab driver, Springfield cab driver, Joe Gervasini, who has a lot of interesting tales to be told. Joe?
Thank you, Dan. I'm, as Dan said, a retired taxi driver, and I have a taxi story that I'd like to share with you, and I have given this story a name. It is called Riding with Betty Boop. And the story's in two parts. The first part is, many years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I shared a cab with another driver. And that means he drove at night and I drove during the day. And this other driver had a nickname, Superfly, because he would not go slow. He was a very fast driver. But he was also very cautious, had very few accidents, made a lot of money, so forth and so on. One day, he decided to pour in the back seat of the cab. And he did this at his own expense. The owner was not going to pay him back for this. And I didn't think anything of it. But the floor mats had a design of Betty Boop on them. And I was never into Betty Boop. I was the wrong age. I never knew much about her. But she became a big topic of conversation among my passengers. I would have elderly people look down at the floor mat and see Betty Boop, and they would tell me that, oh, they saw her cartoons in the 1940s, in the 50s. And then I would have 4-year-old kids look down and see Betty Boop, and they recognized her because they would see her on the cable cartoon networks. So Betty Boop became a big topic of conversation. Part two of the story. I picked up an elderly lady at the Amtrak, and she was going to a class reunion at Mount Holyoke College. And she had to get out a couple of times, once to go to the bank and another time to go to a package store. This was a 3-day class reunion, and she wanted to have enough booze. And she saw the design of Betty Boop on the floor mats. And on the way up to Mount Holyoke College, she told me half of her life story. She was brought up in the Depression. Her father was an agricultural economist for FDR. And she was at Mount Holyoke in the early 1940s, even 1941 when Pearl Harbor happened. So she was quite elderly, probably in her late 70s, early 1980s. And she told me that she had become friends with the woman in Manhattan who was the original voice for Betty Boop. And my passenger, my passenger had become a fashion reporter in Manhattan, so she was in the circle of people who could easily have known the original voice for Betty Boop. Thank you.
That's a good one.
You never know.
You never know, right.
Thank you, Joe. As always, your stories are just wonderful. I always wanted to be a cab driver. I don't know if I ever told you about that, but that's another story for another time. And moving on now to Jonathan Wilkinson, who is, if you saw the last program, you know he's just a wonderful storyteller with lots of experiences, interesting experiences, and so I'm sure you'll enjoy his story.
Okay, as Dan said, I like to travel. I've traveled a lot, and this was it was my first trip to Mexico. And I'm a scuba diver. I love to scuba dive, and I went down to Cozumel for that reason. Well, all Mexican towns are designed around what they call a zócalo, or a zócalo, which could be a town square. Could be one square block, could be many square blocks. And it's where all the activity goes on, and cultural events and dances and social activities. Well, when I was down there was many, lots and lots of beautiful little Mexican children. They're just gorgeous. Little boys and little girls running around, and they were trying to sell you either chiclets or small bracelets for a little bit so they could help their family. And you would get hit up time and time again. I'm 30, 40 times a day. So after a while, it got a little easy to say no. You can only have so many chiclets or so many bracelets. So this is later in the day, and this one little girl came up to me, and she said, "Bracelet, senor?" And I just said, "No, gracias." And she just kind of slumped, and she leaned against me like I was a tree, and she said, "Come on." And I said, "Oh, okay, so I'm sorry." So I said, "Hey, do you like magic?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm doing this in Spanish, ¿te gusta magia?" And so I reach into my pocket, and I pull out a quarter, and I do a very simple, basic sleight of hand trick with a quarter. And her eyes go, "Ooh." And she says, "Do it again, do it again." Okay, so I did that trick again. And 2 times, and 3 times, and 4 times. So eventually she grabbed me and she ran me over where her mother and her aunt were and her little sister. So I did the trick for her and her little sister and did the same trick, and both their eyes went, "Whoa," like that. And 3 or 4 more other kids came over, so I did that trick. Okay, and I said, "Oh, I better do the rest of my repertoire," which was 2 other tricks. I knew 3 little simple coin tricks. And I would do it, and there'd be a couple more kids. And then I'd do the 3 tricks again, there'd be 5 or 6 kids. And then eventually there's 10 or 12, and then 18, then 20 kids, while I do my little 3-trick repertoire over and over and over. That's all I knew. So I said, this is really something. I really could do a lot with this. So the next year I went back, I taught myself a lot of tricks. Okay. And I brought down my clown stuff, my professional clown stuff, my hat and my wig and my vest and shoes and everything on top of my regular luggage, on top of all my scuba equipment. Ridiculous, looked like a freight train coming down. So I would go out, I would get dressed in my hotel, which was right on the Zócalo, and I get my costume on because I'm preparing certain things I don't want the people to see. And then I would go out in the Zócalo, and I would take a piece of chalk and I would make a circle or a semicircle up against a wall. So this is for me and that's for you. And I would sit down and I would very slowly put on a little bit of makeup. Not a lot of makeup. I had a beard then, which of course I didn't as a professional clown. I would take my time, try to attract some attention. When there was a dozen or so kids or more, I would start doing the simple sleight of hand tricks I needed to do up close, and that would bring more people, and that would bring more. And once I got 25-ish people, then I would start doing an act, a professional clown act, and certain things that I had improvised, certain things I'd done in the circus, and more people would come, and more people, and there'd be 100, and there'd be 150, and there'd be 200, and as many as 250 people sometime. And the people down there are so starved for entertainment, especially the children. They were ecstatic. They just couldn't get enough of it. And it was such a wonderful reciprocal energy. It was a performer's dream because I'm doing stuff and they're loving it and it's giving me confidence. And I'm improvising and that's working and the kids are just ecstatic. And, it's just, I wish everybody in their life could find something that rewarding to do for children. And I would finish my act and I would I learned Spanish, and I would say thank you. And I'd say to the kids, I said, look, for the adults, the show is free. For the children, it's 1,000,000 pesos or a big hug. So I'd have all the kids come up and give me hugs and stuff like this. Well, eventually, I started hitting the road, and I said, I'm not bringing my stuff. And I would just travel with my backpack, low-budget hippie style, staying in hostels and sleeping on bus station floors. And I would start doing stuff for the kids, just strictly magic. I had about 15 tricks I could do that time with coins and kerchiefs and napkins and balls and cigarettes, things like that. And it got to the point where when I got into town, if I did the tricks right away, I never got left alone again. I'd get bugged. So if I wanted to go into a town and learn the town and spend a day or two there, that's what I'd do. Then near the end of my stay, I would do this. And the kids, I cannot tell you the response of these children. These are kids living in poverty, not like the kind of poverty we know in this country, but poverty, I mean, you know, underfed and no shoes and dirty and living in houses made of sticks and cardboard and mud. They're treating me like I'm a rock star because I'm doing silly little sleight of hand. I'm pulling a quarter out of my ear or out of my nose or things like this. And that was that spawned the birth of my idea, which I call the SAM Project, which is Smiles Across the Miles. So I've now done this in quite a few different countries, Mexico, all over Central America, 3 countries in South America, Thailand, and it's a wonderful thing. And I hope to keep doing it. I hope to be doing it till I'm too old and beat up to do sleight of hand anymore. And thank you for your time.
Great stuff. Wonderful.
That is great. Thank all our wonderful storytellers, and we have more, you know, that come to that story swap on the 3rd Friday of the month. So just do come sometime. I'm sure you'll love it. But a lot of the stories are folk tales. A lot of them are personal tales. A lot of them are historic tales. And you've seen, if you've watched both programs, some of all of that. And some of them big fat lies. So anyway, I would like to conclude today's program with a story from one of those categories. This was back in 1965. Oh, I can remember it clearly. I was in the Navy. I had been stationed in a naval air reconnaissance squadron in Rota, Spain. I'd been there for a little over 3 years, and I was getting fairly near the end of my tour of duty. I was only actually in Spain about half the time because we always deployed. We flew all over the world. And this one night, though, I found myself in Rota, and I was really alone because all of my buddies either were far, far away on some kind of a deployment or they had duty that night. So I went into town by myself, and I went to one of my favorite bars, the El Florida, and I was sitting there having a beer and chatting with the English barmaid. And it was a very pleasant evening. And I noticed across from the bar, it was one of those horseshoe-shaped bars, there was a gentleman that I was acquainted with. He was a tech rep from one of the suppliers for our squadron. And we weren't really friends, but we were acquaintances. And when our eyes caught each other, he said, "Hi, Dan." And I said, "Oh, hi, Dave. How are you?" Blah, blah, blah. And I went back to chatting with the English barmaid, whose name I believe was Nikki. But so we were talking, and all of a sudden this Dave came over and he sat next to me. And so we talked a little bit, and barroom banter, you know, nothing. And he finally said, "Dan, I've been hoping to talk to you." He said, "I have an idea that I think that you might be interested in." I said, "Oh, really?" He seemed very serious. And he said, "Yes." He said, "I'm thinking of robbing Banco de España, which is a bank just down the street from this bar." I said, "Oh, are you? You know, well, you know, how do you react to a statement like that? You know, the guy said he wants to rob a bank." And I said, "Well, Dave, that sounds interesting. He said, no, I'm really serious. You could tell I didn't take it too seriously. He said, I'm really serious. I've given this a lot of thought. I believe it's an opportunity we should not pass up. He said, I have cased the bank several times. He said, I know how to get in. I know how to disarm the alarms. I know where the money's kept. I know how to get into the secure room. I know when the Guardia, that's the Guardia Civil, Franco's personal army, when they change shifts, so I know when they'd be out of the way for a while. And I happen to know how to exchange, various places where we can exchange a lot of pesetas for dollars. And I said, you're really serious, aren't you? He said, yeah, I'm really serious, and I'm telling you, it's foolproof, it's perfect. I've thought this up and down, I've been thinking about it for months. He said, would you like to go walk around the bank, take a look? I said, yeah, sure, I'll go with you. So I go out and with Dave, and we walk around the bank, and he's very seriously and explains, though, he even explains where the car has to be parked. And he's got every detail. And I said, wow, gee, Dave, as we parted that night, I said, I don't know, I don't know. He said, look, take your time, think about it. He did swear me to secrecy. That was the only stipulation. But he said, take your time. I'll be available. If you have any questions, ask. I can answer them for you. And I thought about this. I thought about this for some time, and a few questions came up about this, that, or the other thing. And every time I'd call or try to see him, he was available, and he answered the questions. We cased the bank a couple more times. And wow. So finally, it was, I think it was probably the beginning of November that we met, and I told him, okay, Dave, I'm in. He said, great. He said, you won't regret this. This is perfect, it's foolproof, and you'll be all set. So we picked a night. It was going to be a moonless night in the middle of November, maybe towards the end of November. A Wednesday night. Oh, by the way, he knew it would be a Thursday night. Excuse me. He knew when the bank had a ton of money, because they did a lot of business. It was Wednesday. I was right. They get the money in on Wednesday because Thursday and Friday are their biggest days, with a lot of people cashing checks and all. So, okay. So, my heart's beating, but I'm waiting, and finally, Wednesday night came. I went over to Dave's house. He lived in San Fernando, which was near Rhoda. And we got in his car. I drove. That was one of my jobs, is to drive. And we drove over, and we parked the car in this little alley right near the bank, and had it headed in a direction so we wouldn't have to maneuver it to get out of there. And we took all our tools. I carried the tools and the flashlight and things like that, and he had a couple of things. And so we got out, we looked around, and nobody in sight. We walked across. Within seconds, he had us in the bank. And then we went around and behind the counter and into this secure room where there was a safe, and there were just bags of cash. I mean, it was unbelievable, bags of cash. And we even had a red light in the flashlight so nobody from the outside would see the light.
That was a very good idea.
As you can imagine. Yeah, well. And who knows, people may have walked by, I don't know. But so we didn't want to be overly greedy, but we grabbed 3 of those bags, and we were leaving. I grabbed the bags. And we left, and as we left, he relocked the door into the safe room. We came by, we left everything exactly as we found it. We went out, he locked the front door, and then he reactivated the alarm system. We looked around, there was nobody in sight. We got into the car, put the money in the back seat, and he got in the passenger side. I drove back to San Fernando, back to his house. And he decided that we say nothing to anybody, and we don't do another thing for at least 3 weeks.
That was very smart.
That was good thinking on his part. This man was smart.
Yeah, I can see that.
He was a very smart man. So a little evil, but very, very smart. And so I went back to the base, and we waited. And thanks to Franco's dictatorship, there was never one word mentioned of that robbery in the media, on the radio, in the newspaper. There was not one word of it on the street. And believe me, I was listening. There was no word whatsoever. I did live in sort of a uneasy state every time I would see the secret police, and I knew who they were from a stint I did on the shore patrol. When I would see the undercover secret, walking in my direction, I was, oh boy, but it was fine. So nothing happened for 3 weeks. Everything is cool. And then we started the job of going to all these various institutions and places and shops and you name it to exchange huge amounts of pesetas for dollars. And we got it all back to Dave's house over time. And then as it became close to the time I was getting out, I actually got out the very beginning of January 1966. I put some of the money into the American bank on the base, which could be accessed from back home, obviously. I sent a lot of the money home in small packages marked carefully, do not open, back to my house in Lexington. And some of it I just kept in my locker. And when I got discharged, it was going to be put in my sea bag. And the next couple of weeks were just horrible. I really wished I didn't do it. I was sure I was going to get caught. It was just a terrible feeling. But what a relief, Jonathan, it was when I finally got back home in Lexington and we had pulled this off. My share, by the way, was $350,000. And of course, that explains why life has been so easy for me from that time on. It explains the condos and the boats, and of course, I relieved my guilt by making a lot of charitable.
Well, you're a person of character.
Right, and so that was just fine. Or maybe, just maybe, the fear of those Spanish jails, that pestering Irish Catholic guilt with a little common sense thrown in, led me to turn down the offer.
There you go.
Thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed the program. We hope we'll see you again on these programs, and we hope we'll see you some third Friday of the month, 1000 Wilbraham Road, for our monthly story swap. Thank you very much, and thank you guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.